Sound design is a process that can be incredibly complex or stupidly simple. There are many different avenues for creating sounds. The two fundamental differences being whether they are synthesized or they are designed from a sample-based recording. Today I'm going to walk you through synthesizing certain staple sounds from scratch. What do I mean by staple sounds? I mean the general term that we give to certain sounds based on their attributes. Things like plucks, wubs, respaces, chord stabs, super saws, and subs. These are umbrella terms based on certain characteristics of the sound. It's kind of like how we use genres to describe music. The songs are different, but they share characteristics that allow us to group them together into the same genre. So today, I'll be using Serum, but most wavetable synths like Vital or Massive will be able to do all the same things that Serum can do. You'll just have to navigate the user interface. So follow along and make sure to save all of the presets that we create in your synth so the next time you need to reach for one of these staple sounds, you don't have to start from scratch. Let's dive in. Okay guys, we're gonna start by synthesizing a basic pluck. So I've written out a little arpeggio here, and let's give that a listen. Okay, so right now it sounds just super basic and not very interesting, nothing special about it. The first thing we're gonna do is dive into Serum and go to our envelope here. Now the envelope determines the shape of the sound, not necessarily the tone, but the shape. And since we want a pluck, we need to create a fast attack and a short decay and maybe add a little release. So I'm gonna go ahead and drag this down till we have something like this. I'm gonna make it a little bit shorter. And let's give it a listen now. Okay, so now it sounds more like a pluck, but it still sounds kind of crappy. So I'm gonna adjust my decay a little bit. We add a little bit of release time so that it doesn't end super abruptly. And let's see. So you can hear it's not as aggressive. Let's go ahead and add this envelope. We're gonna add it to our filter. Turn our filter on. And now when we do that, we can adjust the range that this shape, the shape we created here that's currently affecting our volume, is now going to modulate this filter cutoff here. And you'll see it moving when we play it. So I'm gonna go ahead and play this for you. So you can see it's moving every time the note hits, it follows the shape of this envelope. So here we have the lowest point of our envelope is right here at the very beginning, and the highest point is here. So these two are our attack, and these are equivalent to the range you see here with our little blue strip around the knob. This can be adjusted by grabbing this little circle here in the corner, and you'll see it gets smaller and larger. So now the larger it is, the more the filter is going to have to travel, and it's going to affect the sound. And then you can also decide where it stops and where it starts. Just to keep it simple, I'll keep it right here, and we'll give this a listen now. I'm gonna go ahead and turn the attack back up because I want more of a plucky sound to start with. Now, if you're playing this on your keyboard and you want to create a little more variation in the volume of each note, you can use the velocity module over here. So I'm going to go ahead and drag the velocity onto the level of my sound wave. I'm going to pick where I want it to be the baseline, how quiet I want it to get, and then how loud I want it to get. And I'm going to adjust this a little bit. Now, because I wrote this MIDI in here and it's all the same velocity, it's still going to be all hitting right here. But if I go into my MIDI clip and adjust the velocity of some of these notes to create a little variation, there we go. So this is going to help accentuate some notes while others kind of go into the background, and this variation makes it sound a little more human. So let's listen to it again. And so it's not perfect, but you get the idea. When you're playing on your keyboard, the volume of each hit is going to be dependent upon how hard you press the key on your keyboard, assuming you have a touch-sensitive keyboard. Okay, so now we've created the basic outline for a pluck. I'm going to go ahead and save this. If you're using Serum, you can go ahead and hit this save button here. Now we finished creating the shape of our sound, but this isn't the tone or the character of the sound. That's going to come from all of the different sound waves and effects we add to it, which we can do in the effects module. So I'm just going to create a little distortion to warm it up. I'm going to add a little chorus to widen it. And I'm going to add a little reverb just to push it to the back of the mix a little bit and give it some space. So let's try this now and see how it sounds. Okay, so it's starting to sound a lot cooler. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about subs and respaces. I'm going to roll these into one section because they're super similar, and subs are really easy, especially if you're using a wavetable synth like Serum. All you have to do is activate the sub, and there you go. Now, depending on where you play it on your keyboard, if you start playing in the middle of your keyboard, you might end up with this. And that is not an ideal sub. So you can either choose to play lower on your keyboard, right lower in the MIDI clip, or you can lower the octave like this. I'm going to lower this 2 octaves and see how it sounds. That sounds more like a sub. We could go 3 octaves. I'm listening in headphones, so I'm getting that rumble, but for now we're going to stick with -2. There we go. Now, if you look in our EQ8 down here, you can clearly see where each note it is I'm playing. I'm playing a sine wave. Now, a sine wave is like the purest sound wave you can create, and this can be great if you want to shake some speakers, but they're not usually audible on things like laptops and cell phones. So if you want to create a sub bass that really tears through a mix, you have the option of adding distortion. Now, this is something you have to be careful with and play around with. It's entirely dependent on the sound and the genre of what you're making. But if you want to create something that really tears through the speakers, you can go ahead and add a distortion. Let's just start with tube and see how it sounds. And I'm going to set the distortion, we'll start at halfway. And I'm going to slowly bring in our mix. And you're going to see it starts adding overtones here. And you'll be able to see what I mean by overtones as they appear in the EQ8. I'm not going to get too deep into it. Just know that it's going to make it easier to hear your bass on smaller speakers, but it can also ruin your mix, so you have to be careful. So let's give this a try here. Okay, so you were able to see a few little overtones appear above our fundamental note, and it probably became easier to hear. So now I'm going to crank up the drive a little bit, and it'll get a little more exaggerated. Here we go. Now you can see our sub is taking up a lot more space on our frequency spectrum, and that's what allows it to cut through the mix. So now we're going to create a respace. A respace is just kind of like another type of sub, however it's much softer, less in your face. It has some more layers and harmonics on top of it, like saws to create width, and then we're going to filter them out, and this gives us kind of it's almost like a pad effect. So we're going to start by creating our sub, which we already did. I'm going to change it to direct out. What this is going to do is allow the sub to bypass all of the filters and all of the effects that we will put on here and just be a pure sine wave. So it'll be much more strong when you're listening to it on subwoofers. It doesn't get split width-wise. It doesn't get totally mangled by any distortion plugins or chorus plugins that we throw on the rest of our sounds. And what I mean by the rest of our sounds are our other oscillators here. So let's take a look at oscillator A. We're going to create a saw, and we're going to, let's see, why don't we do 3 unisons? This means we're creating 3 instances of the same wave. Now, why do we want to do that? Well, it creates a little bit of detune between all of them so that it sounds wider and a little more wonky and a little more interesting. So I'm going to play just the sub, and then I'm going to add this saw in with it. Here's the sub. And here is our saw. Okay, now that sounds super annoying right now, but that's okay because we're going to fix that. Next, we're going to turn the random down. Also, if you're using Serum, there's a random knob. This is to randomly assign where the phase starts every time you play a note. If you want a consistent sound, which we usually do with our subs and our basses, you're going to turn that all the way off, and it's going to sound much better across the board. So let's go ahead and turn oscillator B on. We're going to create 7 instances of this one, and we're going to spread them nice and wide with our detune knob here. And then let's turn our random down and let's see how this sounds. Oh, it's even more mangled. But that's okay, because we're going to filter out a lot of that raunchy high end with our filter here. So I'm going to make sure this affects everything, and we'll set it around here. We end up with this. Okay, and that sounds pretty cool. You could use something like that. It sounds very drum and bassy. But we're going to add some distortion. That's kind of cool, but a little much. Give us a little extra. We're going to add some chorus to add width. We're going to add some reverb to create depth. Yeah, now that's starting to sound like a respace. All right, guys, and for our last example, we're going to talk a little bit about the plucky chord progressions you hear in progressive house. So I've written out this chord progression here. We're going to give this a listen on the initial preset in Serum. Okay, now let's dive back into Serum. You're gonna see I already created this and I'm just deconstructing it because I wanted to save time. So we're gonna start with our envelope 1. We're gonna leave it untouched. We want it to max out because we're gonna wanna be able to modulate closing and opening these chord plucks. So we're gonna go into envelope 2 and we're gonna drag envelope 2 onto our filter and turn that filter on. And we're gonna set our range here so that every time we pluck out a chord, it's going to follow this envelope here. So now let's give that a listen. So you can hear it's much more like the plucks we were working with earlier. Next, we wanna create our actual sound. So I'm gonna open up an extra oscillator here. And you see I already detuned it a little bit. And when you aren't using your sub as a sub, you can opt to use it as kind of an extra oscillator, which I did here. So I'm going to turn that on. Now when we listen to it, it's going to have a much fuller, wider sound. Let's give this a listen. And it's not that much more noticeable right now, but it's going to be much more noticeable when we open up those chords. So the next thing I need to do is create a macro that's going to control my decay, sustain, and the start of my filter cutoff. So I'm going to drag this macro onto decay, sustain, and cutoff, and I'm going to adjust the ranges. I did it so they look like this. You can do it to taste or however it fits your song. But now, when I play this chord progression and I open up this macro, you're going to hear it. It'll almost sound like, if you're a fan of deadmau5, you'll recognize this. Let's give this a listen. Okay, so now we have our macro that controls that whole characteristic of these plucky chords, but we want to make them sound a little better. So I'm going to go into the effects tab, and you can see I've already turned on hyper. Now I don't use this for the hyper in this case. I use it for the dimension just to give it a little extra width. So I'm going to play it while I turn all these on so you can hear what they're doing. Okay, and now I'm going to play them opening up so you can hear the big impact these effects have as the chords open up. And then of course you can go ahead and automate this macro. You can draw it into your MIDI clip or play it on your keyboard and record it. And that'll help you achieve this progressive house stabby chord sound.